Characters. Who are they? What are they? Who will they become? So much goes into the creation of a character, their backstory, culture, beliefs, image, eye color, description, personalities, and so much more. As readers, we only get a glimpse of what truly goes into each character. So grab a beverage and get comfortable as we explore this episode's character in depth with your host, Madilynn Dale. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Character Driven. I'm excited to bring you guys a new character and a new author to check out this week. And I also want to mention that there's a lot of shows going on with Go Indie Now as usual. So make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, hit the little bell icon, and you'll get notifications anytime we go live or we drop new shows. But without further ado, let me bring our new guest in and let him introduce himself and the character we're going to be chatting about today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Mike Jack Stoumbos, and I primarily write science fiction and space opera, intermixed with as much hope and humor as I can get in there realistically. And I'm going to be introducing the character Kesiel. Kesiel, who is a lizard. Let's be more accurate. Kesiel is a Tsanghar, a very proud alien species that is one of the core alliance members in the series This Fine Crew. I'm going to go ahead and hold up conveniently Signal Out of Space, This Fine Crew, Book 1, currently the first 4 out in that series, and Kesiel is part of the core cast. She is one of the cadets in the Academy in the first book who becomes part of the crew, the Interstellar Initiative's crew, to do some exploration and outreach, and she tends to be the crowd favorite character of the core cast.
Sweet. So I want to jump into how you built her world, and it's Kesiel, right? I feel like I'm going to butcher that name, and I'm going to try not to. Let's talk about the world she lives in before we dive too much into her character, because I feel like that influences characters quite a bit.
Yep.
So tell me about that.
Sure. I'm going to even take a further step back. So when I was first developing This Fine Crew as a universe, I wanted to hit some of the things that felt like go-to tropes in space opera and science fiction. So, I mean, like most science fiction long-running things in the Star Trek bracket or Stargate or basically anything with star in the title, you've got your version of, the big furry warrior species, the cold-blooded reptile species, the hive mind insect species, and so on and so forth. So I'm like, I'm going to lean into this hardcore. So the cold-blooded reptile species, Tsanghar singular, Tsanghari plural, this was a species that I wanted to play with the idea of having this cold-blooded reptile and put some twists on it and make it fun. And one of the things that I just started doing with this character is I was free writing, weird though it may sound, poetry from her point of view. And so I got to know the planets that she was from, and in her case moons, just by free writing poetry from that this lizard might encounter and that she would bring with her. So if I'm going to have a character that's going to be a little bit cold-blooded and creepy, I want to find ways to also make her entertaining and endearing. And so the interest in poetry to begin with was a big go-to for me. And I was like, all right, if I don't have an exact religion for this particular species, there are a few of them, but if I don't have one that I want this character to adhere to, what will present her value system and her mantra? And so one of the things that she talks about is coincidence. She refers to Tasenda as the poetry of convergence, the idea that things are supposed to align just the right way, and the universe is bringing them together. So everything about the society came from those kinds of concepts. The world that Kesiel is from, it is a planet populated by a bunch of different kinds of reptiles, and among them are the Tsanghar, who are about 3.5 meters long from snout to tail, and will will stretch and curl up in a lot of different ways so that they don't necessarily always stand quite that tall. And the ones that are picked from an early age to possess a decent amount of intelligence and they want to be set on exploration tracks, they declaw them. So they declaw the children at a young age so that they will not have any lean toward violence and combat, so that instead they will focus on more scientific pursuits with their hands. So Kesiel is an engineer, and while many of the other people in her species have a bent toward furthering the Tsanghari name, making sure that they basically making sure that they stand out as well as possible as a whole species. Her approach is, no, I want to integrate. I want to find other people. I'm going to find the best human and become friends with them. I'm going to find the best big furry warrior species known as the Prukta and be friends with them. I'm going to find the best insect species and be friends with them. And so she has a habit of going out and collecting people. And I'm not going to say that she wins them over with her charm per se, but but there's a complete lack of personal barrier, lack of shame in terms of like, well, yes, I am interested. I am here. I am going to pull you into my proverbial web. So yeah, I'm not sure if that was in the right direction, but we're going to get a little bit of mix and match.
Yeah, no, that actually sparked more questions. So how did they pick her, like, how did they pick the children to go on and become certain like people? Like she was chosen to become an engineer. Like how do they go about that? What is there a certain process or testing?
Yeah, so it's a heavily caste-driven society, and yes, there are tests, and also there are things that they believe can be read from people in terms of what they can. Basically, if you were to take like somewhere between a fortune teller and a matchmaker who looks at somebody, is able to get a sense of their temperature and their scale patterns and determine, aha, I think that this is something that you will be able to do. And once they're a little bit older, they are sent to, oh, hello. Once they're a little bit older, they are sent to a temple to receive language. And the ones who are able to be psychically implanted with different languages, if that's even more proof that they can be invested in, be driven up to a higher caste, and then be sent out to be representatives for their species. So Kesiel is somebody who early on passed these tests. She, managed to hatch successfully. She managed to get through some initial cullings. She managed to be selected as bright-eyed enough that they removed her claws, which once you get through the nitty-gritty, it starts sounding like kind of a messed up dystopian society. And thus we get Kesiel's particular brand of like creepy smiling optimism far too often. Yeah. So for people who have only read book one and are wondering about like, wait, time out, how does this work? That's actually one of those things that I get to dive into a lot more in the later books. Book four, the one that came out this last October, is based in the Tsanghari moons. And they actually go get to check out that temple where people receive languages. So yeah, it's a bizarre program. If you look at different kinds of like ancient mythologies where somebody needs to, go through a series of intense tasks or tests to be chosen as the right kind of hero to send on a quest, it's going to follow some of that form, but probably with less of the universal value of humanity than you would get from human mythology.
And I'm curious about the declawing because that instantly makes me think of cats. Is that a similar process for them? Like it takes off like their toes?
So I do not own cats, so I'm not sure if I can say much to that process, but they were frequently described as retractable claws, and so they're digging in a little bit further to remove all of the claw. What's left behind is what you would expect from sort of like a gecko's fingers, where you've got a little bit of that suction going on. Mm-hmm. But when they remove the claws, then there's a little bit more that can be gained from the flexible finger pads that suction. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah, that's probably good because it's not supposed to be good for cats. But where does her curiosity stem from? Is that something like maybe a gene variant that arose in her? Is that common for her species?
I'm not sure if I would say that it's common, but for the ones that are pushed far enough through these kind of caste programs, and are essentially told from an early age, you are a genius. We are going to support you as a genius, and we're going to make sure that you're able to do the kinds of things that geniuses are supposed to do. So Kesiel is somebody who was over-labeled as gifted at a young age, and therefore, follows accordingly. So that is more common among those. So among the members of her species that have already been kind of like railroaded through these upbringing programs and that are going to be sent across the galaxy to be representatives for their species in, combined interstellar initiatives and other kinds of joint ventures between species, you're going to get more of the curiosity, you're going to get more of the weird. And because, it's fun in stories like this to highlight whoever is the weirdest of the group, I'm highlighting Kesiel as the one that even stands out from the ones who stand out from the old.
I like it, though. She sounds like a really cool character, even if she is a lizard. Like, it fascinates me. What is it like for her when she gets into space? What are some of the challenges she faces, like right off the bat?
The initial challenge has to do with ostracization, or the threat of ostracization from her own people and with one of the other species that she wants to try to effect an alliance with. But that's one of those things that she will very overtly tell anyone who asks that it's something she doesn't care about. She is more sensitive about it than she lets on, but she makes a point of pushing forward as if that doesn't affect her. In terms of the actual interactions with space and the hybrid technology between the different species and some of the difficulties and encounters that they run into, how do I get into this without spoilers? So
it is hard to tell.
There's the opening of the second book. So mini spoiler that I will give for people who ask about it. The 4 core characters do survive through the first 3 books. Not necessarily all in one piece, not necessarily no worse for the wear, but they do survive. So So assume that the main 4 characters are going to make it from book to book. In book 2, it actually opens with a scene in which Kesiel is launched from a site of explosion. She is having an EVA moment. She is in an EVA suit, and yet she's launched without a tether. And so she is spinning through space and trying to figure out how to use like what limited redirection she has through like air pressure and her tail to try to get herself facing the right direction so that she can send off a flare to signal for somebody to pick her up. And this is one of those things that weirdly enough was inspired by cats. So the mechanic of how cats land on their feet and how they use their tail and how they twist themselves independently to land on their feet, whether or not they are otherwise rotating in air. That and a little bit of air pressure at the right moments. And so that's how she tends to think through things. There's a lot of like very, very practical, very fast interactions and reactions to things, but at the same time, when things don't go her way, and she manages to be any kind of injured, she also doesn't hold that back either. So if you picture moments in Star Trek Deep Space Nine when Quark is screaming because something has nudged his ear, go in that direction. So loud, high-pitched lizard who also will react and will make herself the center of attention if something does not work according to plan. And then there are other moments where this is a series that I do say for parents. I tell them that it's high peril, low body count. I do work with people under 18. I'm still a teacher, so I make a point of having it be reasonably appropriate. That said, some of the peril does put the characters in situations where they're like, if we do this wrong, it might be the literal end of the world. Okay. And Kesiel approaches it with a kind of fascination. She watches space phenomena happen, and once again, you get sort of the think aloud poetry from her. So reaction to whatever kind of sensation or images are fascinating and that she can appreciate the beauty of, even if that thing ends up killing her.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
That's crazy. So with her being in space, what is her role on the ship?
All right. So in short, non-spoiler version, she is an engineering cadet, and so she's working to learn the pieces that she needs for the hybridized technology because it's multiple species coming together for this venture. And on an ongoing basis, we'll be working from cadet to crewman to ensign and so on and so forth in the engineering department. And then there's a but. Here's the asterisk. In the first book, this is not as much a spoiler because, well, it's the basis of the future books. The core cast ends up making contact with an extra-dimensional entity. Mm-hmm. An extra-dimensional entity which is likely to kill them all if they don't figure out how to deal with it in book 1. And as people say, books 2 and 3, complications ensue. Ooh. Third book kind of caps off that trilogy, that event, with this particular extra-dimensional entity and all the things that it might do to destroy the initiative before it gets off the ground. But it does cement a certain kind of role and relationship between these main 4 characters. It does connect them in a way that it wouldn't otherwise, and gives them access to sort of jobs and representations that they might not have. So Kesiel, by the time we are into, you've earned your commission, you are now on a ship, you're going to actually get to do some of these outreach exploration ventures, you're going to get to do some scientific investigation. Kesiel is not just a cadet who's moved up to ensign who's working in engineering. She is also an ambassador for an extra-dimensional entity and all that entails. And while the others might find that to be something that makes them nervous, or something that scares them in terms of their actual physical health, or scares them in terms of their position in the Interstellar Initiative, or is something to be overcome and possibly to try to stir it out of the responsibilities of, Kesiel gets to lean in all the way. So anytime there is something weird or different where it might require a lens of somebody who is also weird or different, Kesiel's right there. So engineering ensign, who gets to be on sort of early notice anytime there is a space anomaly that might lend to her unexpected expertise.
Another question for you. Because you mentioned the caste system and everything. What is family life like for her species? Do they continue to stay with family, or do they kind of like build their own non-blood family? Non-blood family.
Non-blood family. So here's where we get into some of the weirds, and we can go either very long in this conversation, but I'll try to be brief on this one. They often refer to having a den mother, and that is whatever person is kind of like the main matriarch of a couple of generations before that is in charge of whatever local area. But once they start branching off, they've branched off. So the Tsonghari, they have the option of reproducing asexually or through some amount of gene mingling, and so they just continue to branch. And Kesiel does not, according to what she says to the other characters, does not intend to ever be a parent. She does not actually. She claims that she does not care about her roots back on her home moon and her previous family. So we know nothing about Kesiel's parentage. I say we, meaning audience. I do. I personally have written. I personally have written out the backstory on that one, and I know to whom she's connected. But it is common practice for her to refer to people who are from her home moon or her home moon cluster. She refers to them as sister or sometimes moonkin. And so there's some vague association there, but it's not something that she holds to. It's not a very strict family structure. It's sort of within a den, according to whatever den mother is ruling at the time. There are a series of eggs. They pick the healthiest ones to try to nurture, and she happens to be one of them.
So does she form kind of like a family-like bond with the other main characters?
Yes. Yeah, there's a pretty high degree of found family, and they also borrow each other's traditions for how they refer to family. So that would be a longer conversation going between the different species, but by the end of book 3, they've all sort of borrowed some terms from human, from Prukta, from Teak, and from Tsonghari to refer to each other and to show this kind of like association in this bond.
Ooh, that is really cool. So there's multiple species on the ship with her in space. Oh. Are they all able to communicate in the same language, or do they learn other languages as they move through the series?
Yeah. So I have a ton of fun with this one personally. Most of the other species know that if they're going to work with humans, they decide that they're going to try to learn human. And they do refer to it as human. The book has been translated into German. I have not found out the extent to which like puns transfer over. But it is still referred to as human. Like, they're going to learn human. And this is easy for a couple of the species. So for Tonghari, who have basically passed through the caste system, who are considered geniuses, who are going to be sent, interstellar, they have had a chance to receive language. They have been psychically implanted with the ability to understand human. So Kesiel comes into this knowing human from the psychic imprint of one particular human linguist, which means that she doesn't know everything, but she knows enough English that she can get by, and enough idioms that she can interact with them, and then she sort of teases and makes up other things that she wants to. The main human character does speak human and does not speak much of the other languages. The hive-mind insect species, they have a different process of being imprinted with languages through their queen. So 3 of the core 4 characters have at least a reasonable approach to speaking English or speaking human. And then there's a 4th who has an active translator. And over the course of the series, she gets better and better at being able to communicate with the others without the active translator. In the first book, it's pretty limited, and in fact, it's a bit of a running gag in the first book that like something is going to happen to her translator at some point in the story, and then she'll have to interact without it. So they all manage to communicate with each other. It's just not necessarily as straightforward as one might expect. They don't always manage to get the full meaning across with what they're saying. So one of the books opens with a commentary about some different idioms across species. And so the human character says, that he often suffers from foot and mouth disorder. And then there's a little bit of an aside, and he's like, which I should admit is not the same thing as foot in one's mouth, which is a particular method used by, and then goes into another species and talks about how his insect friend would refer to it differently. These are the kinds of things that I find amusing, so I'm going to plant them in stories when I can.
Yeah, that would be a fun little thing to come across. What is one of your least favorite quirks about her?
Least favorite quirks about Kesiel?
Yeah, or something you don't like about her in general.
Yeah. So I will admit that I really enjoy writing her, and so usually once I'm casting a character and I'm going to stay in their head for a while, I'm going to really enjoy writing them. So there's nothing that I dislike writing. However, when something bad happens to her and Kesiel does start to... I'm going to go with she goes into exaggeration mode. So there's a little bit more of like, once she's tipped past her point of being able to see everything with poetic optimism, then she goes hardcore into end of the world mode. And if I knew her in person, I probably would not appreciate that. It's fun to write. Like it is, it is one of those things that I'm laughing when I'm putting pen to paper, so to speak. I mean, I'm typing, but I would not enjoy that in real life. So there's a section of one of the books where something bad has happened to her. She has been injured, and it is in the aftermath of basically her seeing a spatial anomaly and others not listening to her, or her perceiving that others haven't listened to her, and so she has her moment of externalizing anger, and then she sort of shuts down and is like, "There's no point." And every character goes through that at some point.
Yeah.
You need to have a buddy come around to pick you up and let you know, hey, we understand this is this is kind of a bad time, but we need you to pick yourself up again. So, yeah. So the way in which she gives up, the overly dramatic form of Kesiel give up when she finally hits that breaking point, I think is her biggest weakness as a character.
Gotta love character flaws.
Mm-hmm.
What was your favorite scene to write about her?
Oh, that's really hard. I feel like I should ask some of the readers and figure out which one people like reading the most. Whichever thing made them laugh the most is probably going to be the go-to. um, in the first book, there's a section where, so for a lot of the first book, the core cast, you, the audience, know that they're going to find a way to work together, right? It's set up that way. But there's a period in which they're all kind of distrustful of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're all worried about what might happen if they overstep particular alliances, if they confide in somebody who might actually turn their back on them, and so on and so forth. There's a section about 2/3 of the way through the first book where Kesiel tries to basically strong arm everyone else into doing what she wants, and it's through like it's a lot of fun to write because it's like it's kind of threatening, but also it's threatening with a smile. And it was one of those occasions where when I was writing it, I was like, this is just fun and super indulgent. I will also admit that in a later draft, I actually cut that scene quite a bit. I cut it way down because at the time that I was writing it, I was just letting myself go all in terms of the indulgence. And I'm like, all right, now what will actually serve the book the most? And then I got to yoink some things out of there. But that was one that I recall standing out as a particularly fun one to write. There are probably more fun ones to read, but that one was really fun to write.
Well, Mike, we have reached the end of our time, so go ahead and tell our viewers where they can find you and also this amazing book series.
Yeah. So the best place to find me is MikeJackStoumbos.com. If you're wondering about how to spell the Stoumbos, there's no R anywhere in sight in that last name. MikeJackStoumbos.com. Or if you want to go straight to the series, these ones are going to be available on Amazon, or if you find me in person at various conferences. So This Fine Crew is the series. The Signal Out of Space is book 1. Book 2, we go into A Rupture in Time. Book 3, Seed in the Sky. And then finally, book 4, The Impossible Moon. I shouldn't say finally, because there are 2 more that are coming out. I'm still on the hook for the next 2. So 5 and 6 will be out eventually. And if you go to MikeJackStoumbos.com, there is a This Fine Crew page where you'll be able to find things like concept art. I do have a habit of drawing out my own concept art for whatever it is that I'm working on. Some of it looks like I've spent a very long time on it, and some of it's like, all right, I need to know what this looks like, and I just quickly rattle it out. So yeah, at either of those places you'll be able to find those ones, as well as my other publications, other short stories, upcoming novels, and upcoming appearances at conventions and conferences.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on Character Driven today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And remember, it's always time to go indie now.
The atmosphere of the Stellar 7 orbiting station was simply magical. I experienced a symphony of different voices, the screeches and clangs of moving metal, and disparate bodily functions of more spacefaring species that I knew how to name. Naturally, as I had never before visited an interstellar hub, I had the luxury of bright-eyed fascination about everything I saw. To think that most of my litterkin had never even left the home burrow for more than a day, and yet I was shipping off to the edge of this galaxy to rendezvous with the fiercest warriors to ever reach out across the stars before destroying themselves entirely. But I am getting ahead of myself. From the moment I exited the routeliner, I wasn't thinking about interstellar politics and the greater forces who wrested for control. No, I was being delighted by the little furry numbers who flinched at the sight of me, and would have blanched if only they could change their color. I had not studied more than a few phrases of Belbe, and might have gotten these wrong. "Greetings," I said, trying to sound exuberant, but not hungry. "Which way to upper platform 24?